Teacher humiliated a young boy, but she didn't know his mother was the school principal. The school day had just begun at Ridgeway Elementary, a place filled with excitement as students arrived for the first day of the new term. The hallways were busy with children chatting, laughing, and making their way to their classrooms. Among them was Ethan, a quiet boy who walked slowly, holding his old backpack close to his chest. His clothes were clean but simple, different from the bright and trendy outfits worn by the other students. Ethan kept his eyes down, feeling a little nervous as he passed groups of children who barely noticed him. When he finally found his classroom, marked Class 4B, he stopped at the door and took a small breath before stepping in. The room was noisy, filled with students catching up after the holidays. No one noticed Ethan at first as he stood quietly, unsure of where to sit. Suddenly, a voice from the front of the room cut through the noise. "And who are you?" The class went silent, and every head turned toward Ethan. His face turned red as he looked up to see the teacher, Miss Thompson, staring at him with sharp eyes. I'm Ethan," he said softly. Miss Thompson glanced at him quickly, her eyes stopping on his worn clothes and old backpack. She raised an eyebrow and pointed to an empty desk at the back of the room. "You're late," she said. "Go sit down." Ethan nodded quickly and walked to the desk, feeling the weight of all the stares around him. As he sat down, he heard soft whispers and quiet giggles from the other students, but he kept his head down and tried to focus on blending in. The teacher started talking again, explaining the rules for the class and her expectations for the year. Her voice was firm and strict, and Ethan noticed how easily she controlled the room. He stayed quiet, afraid she might call on him or say something else to make him feel even smaller. When the bell rang for recess, Ethan stayed at his desk as the other kids rushed outside. He wasn't sure where to go or who to talk to, so he decided to stay in his seat. The noise of the hallway faded as he sat there, staring at the desk in front of him. This was not the first time Ethan had felt out of place, but it was hard not to feel lonely in a new school. He didn't know what was coming next, but for now, he focused on staying out of the spotlight. What Ethan didn't know was that the events of the day would bring challenges he couldn't expect, and that the strength he had inside would soon be tested. Ethan sat at his desk in the back of the classroom, feeling small and out of place. Around him, students chatted in excited voices, catching up after the break. Ethan didn't know anyone, and he tried to keep to himself, hoping not to draw attention. Miss Thompson stood at the front of the class, calling for silence. Her stern voice quickly quieted the room. "All right, class, settle down. Let's start by going over what you'll need for this term." She began handing out a list of supplies, walking row by row and pausing at each desk. As she reached Ethan, she stopped and looked down at him. "Where are your supplies?" she asked, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. Ethan hesitated. I didn't get all of them yet," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. Miss Thompson frowned, and a murmur spread through the classroom. "That's not a good start, Ethan," she said, her tone sharp. "How do you expect to succeed if you don't even have the basics?" The words hit him like a blow, and he sank lower in his seat. He could hear soft giggles from the other students, but he kept his eyes fixed on the desk, wishing he could disappear. Miss Thompson moved on, and Ethan let out a small breath, though the embarrassment lingered. He felt the stares of his classmates long after the teacher's attention had shifted elsewhere. Later in the morning, Miss Thompson announced a small group activity. "Pair up and get started," she instructed, writing the instructions on the board. The room immediately filled with noise as students formed groups. Desks were pushed together, and conversations buzzed around the room. Ethan stood up, looking around for someone to work with. He stepped toward one group, but they quickly shifted their desks, making it clear he wasn't welcome. He tried another, but they didn't even acknowledge him. Finally, he sat back down, his cheeks burning. Miss Thompson noticed him sitting alone. "Ethan, why aren't you in a group?" she asked sharply. No one asked me," he said, his voice barely audible. "Well, you can't just sit there doing nothing. You need to try harder," she replied. Ethan nodded but didn't move. He picked up his pencil and pretended to work on the assignment by himself. Around him, the classroom buzzed with chatter and laughter, but he felt completely cut off. When lunchtime came, Ethan walked to the cafeteria with his small lunchbox. He found a table in the far corner and sat down alone. Opening the box, he took out a simple sandwich and an apple. As he ate, he noticed groups of kids laughing and sharing snacks, their voices loud and carefree. Ethan tried to focus on his food, but he couldn't block out the noise. Miss Thompson walked past his table and glanced at his lunch. "Simple meal," she remarked before moving on. Her tone wasn't loud, but it felt like a spotlight had been placed on him. Ethan froze for a moment before continuing to eat, keeping his head low. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. Miss Thompson's sharp comments about his lack of supplies or participation seemed to echo louder each time. The other students, picking up on her tone, began whispering and giggling more openly. Ethan didn't respond, keeping his focus on the desk in front of him. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan felt drained. He packed his belongings quickly, hoping to leave before anyone could say anything else. As he walked toward the door, Miss Thompson stopped him. "Ethan," she said, "you need to put in more effort. It's only the first day, and you're already falling behind. I expect better from you tomorrow." Ethan nodded silently, not trusting himself to speak. He hurried out of the room, his steps heavy as he made his way out of the school. The walk home was quiet, but the weight of the day pressed down on him. He thought about Miss Thompson's words and the laughter of his classmates. It hurt, but he pushed the feelings aside. He had faced tough days before, and he told himself he would just have to try harder. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the sense of unfairness. He had tried his best to stay quiet and avoid trouble, but it seemed like no matter what he did, he ended up being noticed in all the wrong ways. What Ethan didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The challenges he faced today would soon become even harder, but so would his resolve. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet strength was building, one that would surprise even himself when the time came to use it. Ethan sat quietly at his desk, keeping his head down as Miss Thompson stood at the front of the room. Her sharp voice carried through the classroom as she assigned a math problem to the students. "I'll be calling on each of you to solve this," she announced, writing a complicated equation on the board. "Let's see who's been paying attention." The classroom fell silent as students scribbled on their notebooks, trying to figure out the solution. Ethan focused on his page, his heart pounding. Numbers blurred in front of him as he struggled to remember the formula Miss Thompson had explained earlier. "Ethan," Miss Thompson called out suddenly, snapping him out of his thoughts. "What's the answer?" Ethan froze. All eyes turned to him, and his hands grew clammy. He glanced at his notebook, hoping the answer would somehow appear. "Didn't I'm not sure," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Miss Thompson sighed, shaking her head. "This is basic math, Ethan. You need to focus. How do you expect to improve if you don't even try?" A few students giggled, and Ethan felt the heat rise in his face. He sat back in his chair, wishing he could disappear. Miss Thompson called on another student, who answered correctly, earning a nod of approval from her. As the morning continued, Miss Thompson assigned the class to work in groups on a science project. Students eagerly moved their desks together, forming teams of 3 or 4. Ethan stood up, hoping to find a group, but no one made room for him. He approached one group hesitantly, but they avoided his gaze and continued talking as if he wasn't there. Miss Thompson noticed him standing alone. "Ethan," she said, her tone impatient, "why aren't you with a group?" "No one picked me," he admitted, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. Miss Thompson frowned. "Well, you can't just stand there. Sit down and do the project on your own, then. Maybe next time you'll make more of an effort to join in." Her words stung, and Ethan returned to his desk, feeling the weight of the other students' stares. He worked quietly by himself while the rest of the class chatted and laughed in their groups. When it was time to present, Ethan showed his work to Miss Thompson, hoping for some recognition. She glanced at it briefly and moved on without a word. At lunchtime, Ethan carried his small lunchbox to the cafeteria and found his usual spot in the corner. He unwrapped his sandwich slowly, trying not to notice the lively conversations and laughter filling the room. He took small bites, hoping no one would pay attention to him. But as he ate, a group of boys walked by and stopped at his table. One of them, a tall boy with messy hair, leaned over and smirked. "Why do you always sit here alone?" he asked, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Don't you have any friends?" Ethan didn't reply, keeping his eyes on his sandwich. The boy laughed, nudging his friend. "Guess not," he said, walking away. The sound of their laughter lingered long after they left. The rest of the day passed slowly. Miss Thompson assigned a reading activity, asking students to take turns reading aloud. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood up, clutching the book tightly. His voice shook as he read, stumbling over a few words. "Speak up, Ethan," Miss Thompson said, interrupting him. "The class can't hear you." Ethan tried to raise his voice, but the nervousness made it harder to concentrate. The class erupted in quiet laughter, and Miss Thompson shook her head. "You need to practice reading at home," she said. "That's the only way you'll get better." Ethan sat down quickly, his cheeks burning. He kept his eyes on the desk for the rest of the lesson, wishing the day would end. At home that evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his journal, writing about what had happened. He didn't tell his mother, Dr. Morgan, about the remarks or the teasing. She was busy with her work as the school principal, and he didn't want to add to her stress. Instead, he poured his feelings into his journal, describing the loneliness he felt and the way the other students avoided him. His mother noticed that he seemed quieter than usual. "How was school today?" she asked gently. "It was fine," Ethan said quickly, not looking up from his plate. He didn't want to worry her, but she could tell something was wrong. She decided not to press him, thinking he might open up when he was ready. The next day at school, the cycle repeated. During a history lesson, Miss Thompson asked a question about an important date. Ethan knew the answer but was too afraid to raise his hand. Another student answered correctly, and Miss Thompson praised them. "See, that's what I mean by participation," she said, glancing in Ethan's direction. "Some of you could learn from this." Ethan shrank lower in his seat, her words cutting into him. He stayed silent for the rest of the day, focusing on his notebook and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Art class was no better. Miss Thompson asked the students to create a drawing based on their favorite memory. Ethan worked carefully, drawing a picture of a sunny park where he and his mother often went on weekends. When it was his turn to share, he hesitated but held up his drawing. Miss Thompson looked at it briefly. "It's simple," she said, her tone flat. "You could have been more creative. Think outside the box next time." The class laughed, and Ethan quickly sat down, crumpling the paper in his hands. He wanted to cry but held back the tears, determined not to let anyone see how much it hurt. As the final bell rang, Ethan packed his bag and left the classroom quickly, avoiding Miss Thompson's gaze. The walk home felt longer than usual. His shoulders were heavy, not just from his backpack but from the weight of everything that had happened. Ethan wondered if things would ever get better. He felt invisible, like no one cared about his efforts or noticed his pain. But deep down, he told himself to keep going. He didn't know how or when, but he hoped that one day, things would change. What Ethan couldn't see was that the unfair treatment he was enduring wouldn't stay hidden for long. The truth was beginning to surface, and soon, the tables would turn in ways no one could have expected. At home, Ethan's world was quieter, a sharp contrast to the noisy, judgmental environment he faced at school. His mother, Dr. Morgan, was a dedicated principal at a nearby school, spending long hours in meetings and overseeing her staff. While their home was filled with love, her busy schedule often left little time for her to notice the challenges Ethan faced. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, scribbling in his journal. It had become his way of coping, a space where he could express his feelings without fear of judgment. That night, he wrote about Miss Thompson's comments, the whispers from his classmates, and how alone he felt during lunch. Each word was a reflection of the emotions he struggled to share aloud. As he wrote, Dr. Morgan walked into the kitchen, carrying a stack of papers. She placed them on the counter and turned her attention to Ethan. "How was school today?" she asked, her voice warm but tired. Ethan looked up briefly. "It was fine," he said, his tone flat. Dr. Morgan tilted her head, noticing the way he avoided her gaze. She set down her coffee mug and sat across from him. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Just a normal day," he replied, quickly closing his journal and tucking it into his backpack. Dr. Morgan didn't press further, but a part of her knew something was off. Ethan had always been a quiet child, but lately, his silence seemed heavier. She wanted to help but decided to give him space, thinking he might open up when he was ready. That night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about the differences between home and school. At home, he felt safe, even if he didn't always share what he was going through. But at school, it felt like every step he took was judged, every mistake magnified. He couldn't understand why Miss Thompson seemed to single him out or why the other students followed her lead. Dr. Morgan, meanwhile, was working late in her home office. She reviewed reports and prepared for an upcoming parent-teacher conference at her school. As a principal, she prided herself on fostering a supportive environment for both her staff and students. She believed that respect and encouragement were the foundations of effective education. If she had known what was happening to Ethan, she would have acted immediately. But Ethan hadn't told her, and so she remained unaware. The next morning, as Ethan got ready for school, Dr. Morgan reminded him about the parent-teacher conference at Ridgeway Elementary scheduled for the following week. "I'll be there," she said with a smile. "I'm looking forward to meeting your teacher." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. He didn't want his mother to know how Miss Thompson treated him or how often he was left out by his classmates. "You don't have to come," he said quickly. "It's not a big deal." Dr. Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Of course I'll come. It's important to me." Ethan didn't argue further, but the idea of the conference weighed heavily on his mind as he walked to school. He worried about what Miss Thompson might say to his mother and how it would reflect on him. At school, the pattern continued. Miss Thompson's remarks seemed to grow harsher, and the students' whispers felt louder. Ethan did his best to ignore it, focusing on his work and writing in his journal during breaks. He wrote about his fear of the upcoming conference, unsure of how his mother would react if she learned the truth. Dr. Morgan, meanwhile, continued her work with the same dedication she always had. She thought often about Ethan, wondering if she was giving him enough attention despite her busy schedule. She reminded herself to ask him about his day again that evening, determined to connect with him more. By the end of the week, Ethan felt more exhausted than ever. The weight of keeping everything inside was beginning to take its toll, but he didn't know how to express what he was feeling. He thought about his mother's strength and wondered if he could be strong like her. Deep down, he hoped that something would change, but he couldn't see how. As Dr. Morgan prepared for the conference, she made a mental note to ask specific questions about Ethan's performance and experience at school. She wanted to ensure that he was thriving academically and socially, even if he insisted that everything was fine. What she didn't know was that the answers she would uncover would surprise her and force her to take action in a way she hadn't expected. The classroom was unusually quiet as Miss Thompson handed out notices to the students. "These are for your parents," she said, her voice firm. "Next week, we'll have parent-teacher conferences. Make sure these get home." Ethan accepted the paper without a word, staring at the bold heading. Parent-teacher conference, Ridgeway Elementary. His heart sank. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his backpack, already dreading what Miss Thompson might say to his mother. As the class buzzed with murmurs about the upcoming meetings, Miss Thompson clapped her hands to regain their attention. "I expect all of you to remind your parents. It's an important opportunity for us to discuss your progress, or lack thereof," she said, her gaze lingering on Ethan for a moment. Ethan looked down, pretending not to notice. The other students were already whispering about how their parents would praise them or what their teachers might say. Ethan, on the other hand, could only think of the critical remarks Miss Thompson had made over the past few weeks. He felt certain she would tell his mother that he wasn't trying hard enough or that he wasn't capable of keeping up. At home that evening, Ethan hesitated before handing the paper to his mother. She was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing documents for her own school. When she saw the notice, her expression brightened. "Parent-teacher conferences?" she said, reading it quickly. "I'll be there. I've been wanting to meet your teacher." Ethan forced a small smile, but inside, he felt a wave of anxiety. "You don't have to come," he said, trying to sound casual. "It's not a big deal." Dr. Morgan frowned slightly, sensing his hesitation. "Of course I'll come. It's important for me to know how you're doing," she replied. "Besides, I'm sure your teacher will have good things to say about you." Ethan didn't respond. He nodded quickly and went to his room, his heart heavy. He pulled out his journal and started writing about his fears. He imagined Miss Thompson telling his mother that he didn't participate, that he wasn't focused, or that he wasn't fitting in. The thought made his chest tighten. At school the next day, Miss Thompson continued to bring up the conference during lessons. "I hope all of you are ready for your parents to hear about your progress," she said, her voice carrying a hint of warning. "For some of you, it will be a chance to show off your hard work. For others," she didn't finish the sentence, but her tone made it clear she was thinking of students like Ethan. The class laughed softly, and Ethan felt his ears burn. He kept his head down, working on his assignment and trying to tune out the noise around him. Later that day, during recess, a group of boys approached him on the playground. "Hey, Ethan," one of them said with a grin. "What do you think your teacher's gonna tell your mom?" "Bet it's nothing good." Ethan didn't reply. He walked away quickly, pretending he didn't hear them. The teasing wasn't new, but it still hurt. He couldn't help but wonder if they were right. By the end of the week, the tension in the classroom had grown. Ms. Thompson reminded the students repeatedly about the conference, often adding comments about how parents would want to hear the truth about their children's behavior and effort. Ethan tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting to the conference. He imagined his mother sitting across from Miss Thompson, hearing every criticism, every harsh remark. He felt like he was being judged before he even had a chance to explain himself. As the day of the conference approached, Ethan's anxiety grew. He didn't know how to prepare for what was coming or how to explain to his mother what school had been like for him. All he could do was hope that the truth wouldn't hurt as much as he feared. The day of the parent-teacher conference arrived, and Ridgeway Elementary was bustling with activity. Parents filled the hallways, clutching folders and notebooks as they moved from one classroom to another. Ethan sat nervously in the waiting area outside Miss Thompson's room, clutching his backpack tightly. His heart pounded as he thought about what the teacher might say to his mother. Dr. Morgan walked in moments later, her calm presence easing his nerves slightly. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Ready, Ethan?" she asked, her tone light. He nodded, but inside he wasn't ready at all. "It'll be fine," he mumbled, more to himself than to her. The door to the classroom opened, and Miss Thompson appeared, her usual stern expression firmly in place. "Dr. Morgan," she said, her voice polite but distant. "Please, come in." Dr. Morgan extended her hand, offering a friendly smile. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. I've been looking forward to this." Ethan followed his mother inside and sat in one of the student chairs near the teacher's desk. Miss Thompson gestured for Dr. Morgan to take a seat, and then pulled out a folder labeled with Ethan's name. "Let's begin," Miss Thompson said, opening the folder. "Ethan has been with us for a few weeks now, and while he's clearly a bright boy, there are areas where he struggles." Ethan's stomach sank as Miss Thompson began listing her concerns. She spoke about his lack of participation in class, his tendency to work alone during group activities, and how he seemed unprepared on several occasions. "I see potential in him," Miss Thompson continued, "but it's hard to tap into that when he doesn't put himself forward. He's often quiet, and I'm not sure he's fully engaging with the material or his peers." Dr. Morgan listened carefully, nodding as Miss Thompson spoke. She glanced at Ethan, who kept his eyes fixed on the floor. "Thank you for your feedback," Dr. Morgan said when Miss Thompson paused. "It's helpful to hear your perspective, but I'd like to understand more about why he might feel disengaged." Miss Thompson hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. "Well," she said slowly, "it could be that he's adjusting to the new environment. But I believe he needs to take more responsibility for his role in the classroom." Ethan looked up, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. "I try," he said softly, his voice trembling. "But it's hard." Miss Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Ethan, if you're finding it hard, you need to speak up. Staying quiet doesn't help anyone." Dr. Morgan's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. She turned to Ethan. "Is there something you want to share?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes, it feels like no matter what I do, it's not good enough," he said, his words spilling out in a rush. "And when I try to speak up, people laugh. Even when I try my best, it's like it doesn't matter." Dr. Morgan's gaze sharpened as she turned back to Miss Thompson. "Is this the environment he's experiencing?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Miss Thompson flushed slightly. "I can't control how other students behave," she said defensively. "I do my best to encourage everyone to participate and treat each other with respect." Ethan spoke again, his voice steadier now. "But sometimes, the way you talk to me, it feels like I can't do anything right. It makes the other kids laugh at me more." The room fell silent. Miss Thompson opened her mouth as if to respond but closed it again. Dr. Morgan's expression remained composed, but her voice carried a quiet authority when she spoke next. "Miss Thompson, I value the work teachers do, and I know how challenging it can be to manage a classroom, but it's important to ensure that every student feels supported. If Ethan is feeling singled out, we need to address that." Miss Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I wasn't aware he felt that way," she admitted, her tone softer now. "It was never my intention to make him feel isolated." Dr. Morgan nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, but intentions don't always match the impact. Let's work together to find ways to make the classroom more inclusive for Ethan, and for any other students who might feel the same." Ethan looked at his mother, a flicker of hope lighting up in his eyes. For the first time, he felt like someone was standing up for him in a way he hadn't been able to do for himself. Miss Thompson took a deep breath. "You're right," she said. "I'll make adjustments. I'll speak to the class about respecting one another, and I'll pay closer attention to how I interact with Ethan. I truly am sorry if I've contributed to his discomfort." Dr. Morgan smiled slightly. "Thank you. That's all I ask. For us to work together to help Ethan thrive, The tension in the room eased as the conversation shifted to solutions. They discussed strategies for encouraging Ethan to participate without feeling pressured and ways to foster a more inclusive classroom environment. Ms. Thompson agreed to involve Ethan in more collaborative tasks and to recognize his efforts more openly. As they wrapped up the meeting, Ms. Thompson stood and offered her hand to Ethan. "I'm sorry if I made you feel like you weren't good enough," she said sincerely. "You are, and I'll do better." Ethan shook her hand, a small smile appearing on his face. "Thank you," he said. Dr. Morgan placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder as they left the classroom together. In the hallway, she looked down at him and said, "I'm proud of you for speaking up. That takes courage." Ethan nodded, feeling a weight lift off his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt like things might actually change for the better. As they walked toward the exit, Ethan glanced back at the classroom door. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with his mother's support and Miss Thompson's newfound understanding, he felt ready to face it. The days following the parent-teacher conference brought noticeable changes to Ms. Thompson's classroom. True to her word, she began addressing the dynamics that had left Ethan feeling isolated. She started the day by having a class discussion about respect and inclusion, emphasizing the importance of treating one another with kindness. From now on, Ms. Thompson said firmly, "This classroom will be a space where everyone feels valued. That means no more teasing, no more whispering, and no more leaving anyone out. We're all here to learn and grow together." Ethan sat at his desk, surprised by her words. For the first time, it felt like someone had acknowledged what he had been going through. While some students exchanged nervous glances, others nodded in agreement. The atmosphere in the room seemed lighter, and Ethan noticed that even the usual whispers and giggles had subsided. Later that week, Ms. Thompson introduced a new group project. This time, she carefully assigned the teams, ensuring that Ethan was paired with students who were known for being cooperative and kind. As they worked together, Ethan found himself speaking up more, offering ideas and contributing to the task. His teammates listened and even complimented his suggestions, something that hadn't happened before. Ms. Thompson also made a point to acknowledge Ethan's efforts in front of the class. During a science presentation, she praised his creativity and thoroughness, her tone warm and genuine. "Excellent work, Ethan," she said with a smile. "This is exactly the kind of effort and thoughtfulness we need in this classroom." Ethan felt his confidence grow with each small success. He began participating more in class discussions, raising his hand to answer questions and sharing his thoughts without hesitation. While he still faced moments of uncertainty, the positive reinforcement made it easier to push past his fears. Outside the classroom, the students' behavior toward Ethan began to shift as well. The teasing and exclusion became less frequent, replaced by tentative attempts at inclusion. One day during lunch, a group of boys invited him to sit with them. Though hesitant at first, Ethan accepted their offer and found himself laughing at their jokes and sharing stories about his favorite books. Meanwhile, Dr. Morgan kept a close eye on Ethan's progress. She noticed the small but significant changes in his demeanor, how he seemed more relaxed and open, how his eyes lit up when he talked about his day. She made it a point to check in with him regularly, ensuring he knew she was always there to listen. During one of their evening conversations, Ethan shared something that surprised her. "Miss Thompson apologized to me," he said quietly, looking up from his homework. "She said she didn't mean to make me feel the way I did." Dr. Morgan smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked. Ethan thought for a moment before replying. "I think she's trying. I don't feel as scared to go to school anymore." Dr. Morgan nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's good to give people a chance to change, especially when they show they're willing to do better." As the weeks went by, Ethan's growth became even more evident. During an art class, he created a vibrant painting that depicted a sunny park, a place that held special memories for him and his mother. When Ms. Thompson saw the painting, she held it up for the class to admire. "Ethan," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "this is beautiful work. Thank you for sharing this with us." The class clapped, and Ethan felt a surge of pride. For the first time, he believed that his voice and efforts truly mattered. By the end of the term, Ethan was no longer the quiet, invisible boy sitting in the back of the room. He had formed connections with his classmates, found his confidence, and learned to trust his own abilities. Ms. Thompson, too, had changed. Her interactions with Ethan were now filled with patience and encouragement, and her teaching style had become more inclusive for all her students. On the final day of the term, Ms. Thompson called Ethan aside as the class packed up their things. "I want you to know how proud I am of you," she said. You've grown so much, and I've learned a lot from you, too. Ethan smiled, the words filling him with a sense of accomplishment. Thank you, Miss Thompson, he said sincerely. That means a lot. As Ethan walked out of the school that day, Dr. Morgan was waiting for him at the gate. He ran up to her, his backpack bouncing as he moved. Hey, Mom, he called out, his voice full of excitement. Dr. Morgan knelt down to meet him, pulling him into a hug. How was your last day? She asked. Really good, Ethan replied, his smile wide. I think next term's going to be even better. Dr. Morgan stood and took his hand as they walked home together. She couldn't have been prouder of her son. His resilience, his courage, and his ability to rise above the challenges he had faced. And as they turned the corner, she knew that no matter what lay ahead, Ethan was ready to face it with confidence and strength. The school year ended on a high note for Ethan. What had started as a difficult journey full of challenges had transformed into a story of growth and change. Ethan's quiet determination, coupled with his mother's unwavering support, had not only helped him find his confidence but also led to a meaningful transformation in Ms. Thompson's teaching approach. Ms. Thompson, once known for her stern and unyielding demeanor, had become a more compassionate and understanding teacher. Her willingness to reflect on her actions and make adjustments had created a classroom environment where every student felt valued. Ethan, in particular, had flourished under her newfound encouragement. By the end of the term, he had emerged as a more confident and engaged student, unafraid to speak up or share his ideas. For Ethan's classmates, the changes in Ms. Thompson and Ethan's growing confidence set an example. The teasing and isolation that Ethan had once endured were replaced by camaraderie and mutual respect. The classroom became a more inclusive space, benefiting not just Ethan but everyone. At home, Dr. Morgan couldn't have been prouder of her son. She had always believed in his potential, but seeing him thrive and find his place among his peers was a reward beyond words. She knew that the journey hadn't been easy for him, but his resilience had turned the tide. As Ethan prepared for the next school year, he reflected on everything he had learned, not just about himself but about how people could change. Ms. Thompson's apology and her efforts to improve had shown him that even adults could grow and learn from their mistakes. It was a lesson he would carry with him for years to come. The story of Ethan and Ms. Thompson served as a powerful reminder of the importance of empathy, kindness, and understanding. It highlighted the impact that small changes in attitude and behavior could have on someone's life. For Ms. Thompson, it was a chance to rediscover the true purpose of teaching, to uplift and inspire every student, no matter their starting point. As Ethan walked through the school gates on the first day of the new term, he did so with his head held high. The challenges he had faced had made him stronger, and he was ready for whatever lay ahead. This story is a powerful reminder of how small acts of kindness and understanding can make a huge difference in someone's life. It teaches us the importance of looking beyond appearances, standing up for what's right, and fostering an environment where everyone feels valued. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on how you can bring more empathy and kindness into your own life. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that change is possible, and that even the smallest steps can lead to something incredible. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Let's keep spreading positivity and learning from one another. Together, we can create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. Thank you for watching.